They dragged me out in handcuffs, right in front of the people who once trusted me, and as the clicks of those cuffs echoed across the square, the same old wound ripped open the wound of being treated like a liar, a fraud, a nobody. My name is Elira Donnelly, and that morning, as strangers stared at me like I was a criminal, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't the first time someone tried to erase who I really was, but it would be the last. Charleston always woke under a thin sheet of mist drifting across the harbor, softening the streets before the sun climbed high enough to burn it away. I'd grown used to greeting the day with the low bellow of a cargo ship and the sharp rise and fall of an ambulance cutting through Meeting Street. Those small, familiar sounds had become the rhythm of a life I'd carefully pieced together, quiet, steady, almost ordinary. For a while, that illusion held: a modest apartment, neighbors who waved from their porches, a routine that asked nothing more from me than showing up and keeping my head down. I never invited questions. I never opened doors to anything resembling the past. Peace, as fragile as it was, had become something I clung to with both hands. That morning began exactly the same warm coffee in my palm, the faint sweetness from the bakery drifting through the square in front of City Hall. I remember thinking the day felt light, almost generous. Then the air shifted. A military vehicle screeched to a halt, tires screaming loud enough to slice through the murmuring crowd. Conversations died mid-sentence. People stepped back instinctively as 4 members of Shore Patrol jumped out, followed closely by 2 NCIS agents, whose eyes locked onto me with surgical precision. One lifted his arm and pointed. "Elira Donnelly. Hands behind your head." The cuffs snapped shut before I could breathe. Cameras rose. A child whispered a question his mother couldn't answer. And as they pushed me into the vehicle and the city blurred away, I felt my life, my carefully built, quiet splinter apart. This wasn't a mistake. It was the beginning of something I'd feared would one day find me. The interrogation room at Naval Weapons Station Charleston felt colder than any metal table inside it, the kind of cold that crawled under your skin and stayed there. The sharp disinfectant scent clung to the air, dragging my mind back to field tents lit by flickering lamps. Nights when the only certainty was that someone would bleed before sunrise. I forced my breathing to fall into the slow rhythm I'd spent years perfecting, even as Eddings and Moore settled into the seats across from me. They pushed a thin stack of documents toward my side of the table. The accusations sat between us like a live wire impersonating special operations. No hesitation in their eyes. No doubt. Just the expectation that the person in front of them was pretending to be something she wasn't. I kept quiet, because the truth wasn't something I was ever allowed to give away. Moore flipped to a report and read aloud the name of the man who had filed the complaint. Lance Corporal Brandon Lowe. The room tilted just slightly, but enough for the memory to pulse against the back of my skull. Lowe, covered in dust and blood. Lowe, gasping for breath as I dragged him behind a crumbling wall while bullets shredded the path we'd just run through. Lowe, whose life I had fought to keep from slipping away by the minute. He never saw my face. None of them ever did. The mask that hid every operator's identity was meant to protect everyone involved, including the soldiers who had no idea who had pulled them back from death. And now, the same man was unknowingly pointing a finger at the person who had saved him. Moore continued reading the accusations. Lowe claimed I'd bragged about a hostage rescue in 2014, a mission erased so thoroughly from the record that even most high-ranking officials believed it never happened. Someone was dragging fragments of a buried past into the present, stitching them into something that made me look like a liar. The silence I was required to maintain only fed their suspicion. Then Moore leaned forward and asked me for the codename of a sniper position used during that same operation, a detail only 5 people in the entire country would recognize. My heartbeat didn't change, but something inside me tightened like a snare. There was no way a man like Lowe, or any civilian, would know that. Someone with dangerous access was feeding information to guide this entire investigation. Whoever stood behind Lowe wasn't doing it to expose a fraud. They were trying to unlock a vault that had been sealed for years. Someone was prying open a door that was never meant to see the light again, and I was sitting exactly where they needed me to be. When Eddings asked me to stand, I didn't argue. I lifted my arm slightly so he could check for concealed weapons, but the fabric of my shirt shifted just enough to expose the curve of my right rib cage. His gaze froze there, sharp and electric. Moore leaned in, eyes narrowing the moment he recognized that it wasn't just ink. It was something intentional, layered, precise. The orchid had faded slightly over the years, but its meaning hadn't. To most, it would look like a stylized flower. To the few who had earned it, it was a banner carved into skin. Orchid 6, a unit that had been erased from the official world long before anyone in this room had gotten their first promotion. A symbol smaller than a pinhead sat beside one of the petals, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. That was the detail that sent Eddings and Moore into a heated argument right in front of me. They couldn't decipher it. They weren't supposed to. The more they tried, the more obvious it became that someone else had known exactly what they were looking for. The realization hit hard, heavier than any accusation they'd thrown so far. If NCIS was seeing this tattoo for the first time, then whoever had guided them to this moment had already seen it recently, closely, deliberately. The thought burned in my chest like a warning flare. Then the camera shifted, quietly, almost gracefully, not toward procedure, but toward me. Someone had manually taken control, someone who wasn't part of the scripted interrogation unfolding in front of me, someone who wanted to watch, not to protect me, not to uphold an investigation, to measure my reaction, to see what I would give away. I didn't move, keeping every muscle steady, but inside, everything sharpened at once. This wasn't confusion, and it wasn't incompetence. This was deliberate, coordinated, and it wasn't about a misunderstanding or an accusation. It was a hunt, and I had just been flushed out into the open. Part 3, Chapter 4. The questions only Orchid 6 would recognize, and the ghosts that returned with them 300 words. The room looked the same, but the atmosphere had shifted into something tight and volatile. Moore moved with a caution he hadn't shown before, and Eddings scribbled notes like he was trying to steady nerves rather than record testimony. Whatever facade of control they'd held earlier had thinned enough for me to sense exactly what I had feared. Someone had opened a door neither of them understood. Moore's questions changed first. They no longer hovered around accusations. They struck directly at the seams of operations buried under layers of denial. When he asked where I had been during the week of Blue Canyon in 2014, the memory rose uninvited. I gave him the only answer the oath allowed, and he reacted as if he'd predicted it. But his next question cut deeper than any of the others. He asked about Perch 12, and whether it allowed a clear line of sight to the east. The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Perch 12 was not a location anyone could invent. It belonged exclusively to Orchid 6, spoken during training. Spoken again during the night the unit was ambushed, and 4 of us didn't make it out. NCIS had no earthly path to that information, which meant a high-level source, someone with access to Omega restrictions, was feeding them intel on purpose. They were cornering me. Answering would expose who I really was. Staying silent cemented their belief that I was a fraud. Moore demanded to know why someone claimed I had access to Omega-level designations. That classification died in 2016, buried with the casualties connected to it. Hearing him say it felt like dirt being scraped off graves I'd tried to protect. Then Eddings mentioned that someone wanted a head count on who from Orchid 6 was still alive. And everything snapped into focus. NCIS wasn't investigating me at all. They were being maneuvered, used as bait to flush out the last survivor. Moore listed Nevada, Bahrain, Ankara. Locations only Kessler should have known. Someone was resurrecting the hunt. Orchid 6 died trying to stop. A faint step behind me, heavy, uneven, sent ice through my chest. I knew that gait from the night of the ambush. Someone from the past was here, watching, waiting, and the game had officially changed. Moore steered the conversation back to the tattoo like he was testing the edges of a wound. My silence rooted in obligation. Not fear, only tightened the tension around us. He warned that withholding cooperation would force a higher classification review. I told him there were clearances above his reach. The room froze as if the walls themselves were listening. Moore leaned toward me, asking what authority I meant. I answered that it belonged to someone who once oversaw special activities. His expression faltered. He reminded me that those people were retired or dead. I countered with quiet certainty, not all of them. He demanded a name, but I didn't speak it. Instead, I folded my fingers together, hands resting on the table, a gesture known only among operators requesting command-level contact. Moore's eyes widened when he recognized it, understanding instantly that I wasn't performing or bluffing. Eddings accused me of spinning legends, but I told them I needed someone with real authority. Their frustration cracked into fear. Moore said that person no longer existed. I repeated that one did. He slid a sealed file toward me, revealing information about 6 other veterans who'd recently been approached by unknown parties, each tied to programs with erased records. A cold jolt ran up my spine. This wasn't a hunt for me alone. Someone was targeting everyone who had ever served in programs meant to remain invisible. Moore explained that a defense official might be reopening the list of those marked deceased, trying to find who had survived. Instinct pushed me to my feet. That list had only been seen by 3 people myself: Kessler, and the one man whose betrayal I had never wanted to confirm. The realization sank into Moore's expression. He whispered that I wasn't pretending to be anything. I rested a hand over my ribs, feeling the mark hidden there. "You aren't the only ones searching for the truth," I said softly. Just then, an alarm pulsed through the hallway guardian protocol. A secure line from Norfolk. Moore turned pale. Eddings stood frozen. And I closed my eyes, because I knew exactly who was on the other end. Moore and Eddings moved me into a different interrogation room, the kind designed for confrontation rather than dialogue. The moment the door opened, I saw a man in a civilian jacket sitting at the center table, shoulders curled inward, hands clenched together as if he was trying to hide them. His gaze flicked up only for a second, enough to show fear, but not recognition. I had never seen him, not on a mission, not on a base, not anywhere. He was the second accuser. Eddings dropped his file on the table and announced that this man claimed I had spoken to him about Ankara in 2015. The name alone sent every muscle in my body tightening. Ankara wasn't a mission anyone in NCIS should even know existed. Only 3 members of Orchid 6 ever knew the full scope. 2 of them were dead, which made his claim impossible unless someone was feeding him details. I asked how he knew. The man trembled and whispered that he had only repeated what he'd been told to say. Moore turned pale. It was the unmistakable signature of coerced intelligence, the type used by foreign handlers who didn't want their pawns thinking for themselves. I stood and faced the 2-way mirror behind us. Whoever was watching wasn't interested in building a case. They were testing boundaries, using me like a key to unlock whatever remained of Orchid 6. Moore asked why anyone would want that, because someone once in command wanted access to something that should have stayed buried. The man suddenly broke down, admitting they threatened to make him disappear if he didn't comply. That fear wasn't staged. It was real. Before Moore could pull me out, an alarm ripped through the hallway. All security panels lit red. Unauthorized access to Omega-level files. Someone wasn't just digging into Orchid 6. They were excavating the entire classified architecture surrounding it. My arrest had been nothing more than the opening act. We barely made it into the hallway before the intercom boomed overhead, its tone deep enough to silence every passing officer. "Code Guardian E, secure line from Norfolk." Moore turned to me, eyes tight with something that looked like realization mixed with dread. I nodded. He knew I knew exactly who was calling. A Navy officer sprinted toward us and announced that all interrogation procedures were to cease immediately. Moore froze. Eddings snapped into rigid posture, as if bracing for impact. The secured operations room opened, and a massive monitor flickered to life. A woman appeared, silver hair tied back, posture unbroken, presence sharp as a blade. Admiral Adrienne Kessler. My spine straightened on instinct. Years had passed, but muscle memory didn't forget her. She didn't look at me first. She fixed her gaze on Moore and Eddings, telling them they were holding someone far beyond their clearance. Moore tried to explain, but she cut him off with the cold precision only career commanders possess. Then she addressed me, voice weighted with something far heavier than protocol. "They found you, didn't they?" I nodded. She raised a black binder to the camera. 3 red seals, 1 line of text, Orchid 6, commander level, access only. Moore nearly collapsed under the realization. NCIS had stepped into territory they never even knew existed. Kessler explained the second accuser had been coerced, and the entire investigation was a setup meant to flush surviving members of Orchid 6 out of hiding. Moore asked whose trap it was. Rear Admiral Graham Sheldon. The name hit the room like a detonation. Sheldon was hunting us, and I was the last piece he needed. Kessler ended the call with a single order. Bring her to the strategy room. No one touches her again. The screen went dark, and I finally understood the shadows I'd outrun for a decade hadn't faded. They'd simply been waiting. The strategy room at Charleston felt less like a briefing space and more like a sealed bunker meant to hold back the past. 3 locks clicked behind me. A guard watched my every move, hand resting on his weapon, as if he sensed what kind of truth lived in this room. Kessler stood at the far end of the table, her posture as sharp as ever, though her eyes held the weight of years she had carried alone. She set a thick black folder in front of me, marked with 3 red seals, Orchid 6. A name erased from every official channel, a program buried so deep, even whispers of it had become dangerous. Kessler opened the file, and the faces hit me with brutal clarity. My team, the 4 who never walked away from the 2016 ambush. I felt that familiar sting in my chest, the one I had spent years pushing down, believing I'd buried it for good. Ankara wasn't a failure, she said. It was sabotage. The saboteur Graham Sheldon, the man who sent us in blind, the man who demanded Orchid 6 be wiped to protect national security, the last man to see my team alive. But the truth was uglier. He'd sold intel to a foreign buyer. The ambush had been the cost. Every surviving member had since died by suspicious means, each labeled an accident or illness. All except me. Now Sheldon needed the final piece, my memory, the location of the original files, the last authentication key. Kessler told me I could keep hiding, or I could fight for the ones who never made it home. It wasn't a choice. It was a calling. I lifted my chin and answered it. The plan came together fast, the kind of operation stitched from urgency and the unspoken understanding that there were no second chances left. NCIS, Kessler, and I aligned our pieces, using the old Orchid 6 signal as bait. 3 short pulses. 2 long, a code only 1 man alive would recognize. The man who once commanded us. I sent the signal. His response came back instantly. Kessler didn't need words. The look she gave me said everything. Sheldon would come alone. Convinced I was ready to surrender, Charleston drowned under a punishing rain that night. Wind tore across the harbor, turning the water into silver ribbons under the dim pier lights. I waited exactly where he expected me, no coat, no shelter, nothing to hide behind. A heavy silhouette approached, stride strong but uneven from an old wound. I knew that limp. I had heard it the night my team fell. He said my name like it was a final move in a game he believed he'd already won. He called me the last piece, demanded the original files, promised blood wouldn't be necessary if I cooperated. I looked him in the eye and told him the truth: my team died because of him. His smile sharpened with cruelty. He called their deaths patriotic, called my survival stupidity. When he ordered the authentication code, I triggered the silent beacon beneath my shirt. 4 security lights ignited at once. NCIS flooded the pier. Kessler emerged from the shadows, rain cascading off her coat, voice carrying authority that cut through the storm. Sheldon realized too late he'd been led here. He reached for his weapon, but instinct took over. I twisted his wrist, drove him down, and felt the old training snap back into place. Cold steel locked around his wrists, the same metal that once bound mine. And while the rain kept falling, the storm inside me finally broke. Morning broke clear and sharp. Charleston washed clean after the storm. It seemed to my tent. When they summoned me back to the strategy room, I felt the shift instantly. No tension, no suspicion. Only a quiet acknowledgement of what had finally surfaced. Kessler handed me a card marked with a seal I never expected to see beside my name. Orchid Survivor Verified. For years, the tattoo on my ribs had been treated like a crime. Now it was proof, recognized by the same Navy that once erased us. The relief that rose in my chest felt almost weightless. Later, Kessler brought me to a secure room in Virginia. Inside, nearly a dozen women waited, each carrying the same restrained gravitas, each shaped by programs buried so deep, even their existence had been denied. One of them stepped forward, took my hand, and whispered that she thought she'd been alone. But none of us were alone anymore. Looking around that room, I understood the path ahead: reconnect the forgotten, protect those still targeted, and make sure no one else lived invisible the way we had. They once cuffed me in public, but I was never born for chains. Thus I